All right. Thank you everyone for joining me for tonight's One Night Stand presentation. This is a series of presentations that we do at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art where we focus on one work of art and one artist for one night. Tonight I'll be discussing Pearl Fine's Pale Gold Oval Painting from 1979, created with watercolor, pencil, acrylic, and charcoal. This work is currently on view in our exhibition Beyond the Object, Women Working in Abstraction, which runs until October 26th of 2025. However, since this piece is a work on paper, it will be swapped out with another piece about halfway through the exhibition. So if you're interested in seeing this in person and you're in the area and want to stop by, make sure you do that in the first 6 months of the exhibition so you can catch this piece in the gallery. The exhibition that this piece is in seeks to highlight women in the CRMA collection working in abstraction. It was inspired by the greater attention being paid to women artists who have been working in abstraction and developing abstraction from the beginning, and who are often overlooked or not included in conversations about abstract art. Pearl Fine is very much one of these artists who was actively involved in abstract expressionist circles, well regarded by other artists and critics, and her work contributed to the visual language of abstract expressionism, and yet many people don't know much about her. This piece became part of our collection through a donation from Werner, also known as Wynn, and Sally Kramarsky. They began collecting in 1958 with the purchase of a drawing by Jasper Johns, and their collection was loosely focused on minimalism, post-minimalism, and conceptual art. Every so often, they would donate a portion of their collection to a museum, and so in 2009, they donated 20 drawings, or in the case of this work, a painting that also incorporates drawing, to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, allowing us to be able to say that we have a number of wonderful artists in our collection, including Sol LeWitt, Lois Dodd, and our focus tonight, Pearl Fine. There is one other piece that was donated by the Kramarskys that's also included in the exhibition where Pearl Fine's piece can be found. It's an untitled work by Margaret Lanzetta, and so if you visit, keep an eye out for that piece as well. But tonight we're focusing on this piece, which comes toward the end of Pearl Fine's life. And so I wanted to briefly discuss her work leading up to this piece, and then we'll circle back to it at the end and talk a little bit more about it. So to begin, Pearl Fine was born in 1905 in Boston. She started her career at the Boston Practical School of Art, and in the late 1920s, she moved from Boston to New York to study art. In New York, she studied under Kimon Nicolaides, who was her mentor at the Art Students League, and here you're seeing a piece by him. So he had some early influence on her. He was very involved in drawing, talked a lot about drawing, actually wrote a book about drawing as well. And during this period leading into the 1930s, she's really kind of firmly establishing herself in a non-objective style. And so by the 1930s, she's kind of firmly anchored in that style. During the 1930s, she starts attending Hans Hofmann's studio sessions. And I've got a work by Hofmann here, Still Life Yellow Table on Green from 1936. And while she's working with him, she's also studying the work of European abstractionists, looking at European masters, getting exposure to Cubism, Fauvism, Surrealism, as well, all of these isms that we think about leading into abstract art. And one of those influences, one of those European masters that she looks at is Braque. There are quite a few similarities at this time in her work to what Braque was doing. So there's some influences that are coming across there. And that includes her handling of paint, the tension that she's incorporating between the flattening of the picture plane and its tactile depth as well. And like Hofmann and Braque, she was contrasting sharper edged forms with organic shapes in her work at this time. Something that Fine has kind of always had is this inherent gift for color. And as we saw from that Hofmann work, his works could be quite colorful. And so that was something that she really honed while working with him and really transformed into a mastery of that through these classes with Hofmann. She was really interested in cubism and using these repetitive flat forms to impart rhythm and dimension into her Cubist still life series. And that idea of repetition and rhythm is something that will carry through and that we'll see in other works by her as well. She did break with Hoffman's theories in some respect and kind of sought to find her own more calm and contemplative mode of expression. During this period, she's working and becoming an active member of this New York school that's developing at the time. And for her, a lot of her inspirations that would carry through in her career are music and dance and the natural world. And her titles will point to that and this search that she has for universal meaning. And we see some of that interest in music coming through in this piece. Into the 1940s, Fine is also interacting with the American Abstract Artist Group, and through them, she's able to meet Piet Mondrian. She would actually visit him in his New York studio, and he has a big influence on her work, and especially some of her later works. So keep that in mind for a little later on. Here I'm showing you his last piece before he died. It's actually an unfinished work, Victory Boogie Woogie, from 1942 to 44. This comes from a period when Mondrian is kind of playing with these colored tapes, and so he's using them a lot in this piece. So when it was completed, or actually not completed, it was an unfinished piece, but when it was collected by one of his collectors, she was worried about the piece because it had all these tape pieces that were stuck to it. And so it was kind of unstable. And so Pearl Fine was actually commissioned to create a precise copy of this piece. One copy that would be exactly to what this unfinished piece looked like, and another that was to be her own interpretation of where the piece was going. So here you see her working on that copy here. Um, and this is actually something that has continued to be important for the preservation of this piece. It's actually been used, the copy has been used in conservation treatments for the piece to kind of look back and see how it originally appeared when the copy was created in 1947, shortly after the piece was unfinished. And so she had this time to spend closely looking at the Mondrian, um, really kind of diving in deep to what he was doing. And that's something that sticks with her throughout the rest of her career. Also, during this period, during the early years of World War II, Fine and other early abstractionists are engaging in breaking down the representation of objects into essential elements and creating their own alternative visual language. And that was something that was true amongst multiple different art forms. So, dancers and poets, writers, they're all attempting to find new forms and break apart established norms and really create their own kind of creative, dynamic form. During this period, she involves a lot of really inventive shapes in her paintings of the 40s. They're not necessarily surrealist in concept, not meant to be kind of surrealist in concept, but they do have a similarity to some of the surrealists and what they were doing with biomorphic forms. Things like some of the paintings of Johann Miro, Mark Rothko, and Arshil Gorky. In this piece from 1944, Enigma, she's incorporating these jewel-like colors that create this very kind of buoyant, upbeat mood. Um, and she's also creating these floating forms in space, but also very kind of introspective, also very intellectual, thinking about the title as this unanswerable question. From the same year, Carousel, where the artist is imitating this swirling motion with lines that seem to flicker like fireworks. And in this case, she's still incorporating these floating forms in space, but here looking more so at something like a circus ride. During this time, she's also gaining more recognition. So after World War II, she received a grant from the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation and showed at both Peggy Guggenheim's Art of this Century Gallery and the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which is now the Guggenheim Museum. She also had her first solo exhibition held at Willard Gallery in New York in 1945. And in 1949, she was one of very few women artists invited by Willem de Kooning to join the club, which was the intellectual artist group that he and Franz Klein led. This is something that they had founded shortly before this, a group of downtown artists, and this community would become some of the best known artists of their generation. It would include artists like Ad Reinhardt, Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and less known but no less involved was Pearl Fine. So she really is part of this first generation of abstract expressionism. And this group that was really aiming to make art that was abstract, but also expressive and emotional. By the early 1950s, Fine and most of her peers were developing large-scale abstract paintings and sculptures with gestural, highly energized surfaces. And throughout this period, by the late 1950s, she's becoming increasingly more vigorous in her gesture. She's incorporating a thick impasto and also this larger format that she's working in. Also in the 50s, in 1954, she moves to East Hampton with her husband, Maurice Berezoff, to escape the pressure and politics of New York City. In the city, there was this increasing artistic density and commercialism of the downtown art scene, and it just wasn't really something that kind of jived with who she was and her approach to art. So she actually followed the lead of her good friend Lee Krasner and her husband Jackson Pollock, who had purchased an isolated farmhouse in the town of Springs some years earlier. And over the years that would follow, her work would transform to incorporate less extensive brushstrokes, more of a grid-like composition, and a more muted palette. She also started to enrich her paintings of this period with an inventive use of collage, so embedding shapes of cut canvas, metal foil, and fragments of woven basket into the paint. And here you're seeing some of that collage coming through in this untitled piece from 1957. She would also continue to use pencil and crayon drawing, integrated both under and over the paint layers. In this piece, Surrealist Dreams from 1959, she's making a nod to those early European influences, still thinking about them, and incorporating paper clippings, strips of mylar, as well as a bit of chalk and graphite. She's interested in depicting reality and creating this expression of emotion, not about what is represented, but rather about what's been omitted and creating an expression through that. Into the 1960s, she continues to reduce her compositions toward feelings of nothingness with her Cool series, which is what you're seeing here. These are similar forms that are incorporated into this series with alterations made to the color. And also some of the shapes as well. So there's subtle variations. The color was kind of the main thing that she was altering, but the series is one of her most challenging, is how she'll describe it. Often the color compositions wanted to emote a feeling, and this was in opposition to the expressionlessness that she desired from these pieces. So something that she kind of struggled with in this series. Also during the 60s, she starts working with these low relief works. So incorporating wood and wood pieces to create a three-dimensional piece. In these, there's a lot of importance placed on surface and the edges of the low relief pieces. It emphasizes their quality as an object and also their relationship to its surroundings and the surrounding architecture. She's becoming very interested in repetitive rhythm, something that we'd seen before, but also geometry. And one of her quotes from this period, thinking about what she was doing during this time, is, quote, "For me, true reality exists in the aura of the unknown. What we see with our eyes on the canvas is but a small portion of an audacious system of symbols and concepts and is truly incapable of rationalization," end quote. And she's always kind of looking at her abstraction as this exploration of something that is previously unexplored. She also starts to teach during this decade. She began to teach at Hofstra University in 1962. And she's also starting to work with undulating geometric patterns that seem to perhaps harken back to musical progression, referencing musical progression. And during this time as well, she's also a visiting critic and a lecturer at Cornell University. Now we're moving into the 70s and 80s and her later work. Um, and this is when she starts to really work in this kind of calmly ordered atmospheric system, a real kind of search for order, um, somewhat like minimalistic music. And this particular series that she's working in the 70s and into the 80s as well is accordments, her accordments series, which is a word that she apparently invented for these pieces. These are atmospheric screens of horizontal and vertical painted lines. They kind of create these floating webs that have these repeated threads of color anchored to the grid of subtle pencil lines. They're often designated by number, and many of their titles as well summon up images of contentment or of a kind of sublime orderliness that continues on into infinity. So here, Accordment Series number 4, Shimmering Faintly, and Accordment Series A Timelessness number 8, and Accordment Series number 33, A Blue. So during this time, and particularly with this series, she's thinking about that overall grid, very much going back to that influence of Mondrian. She's making subtle variations in the paintings to disrupt the regularity of that grid and keep the eye moving back from the edge back to the center. And this is something that will kind of occupy her really until the end of her life. She dies in 1988. Like I mentioned, she is less well known than some of her male colleagues, and that's despite being respected by those same male colleagues and many critics at the time. And there could be a lot of different things that contributed to this lack of knowledge and lack of recognition that's gone forward in time with her. One of the things that people sometimes point to is her own lack of promotional skills. And I think that might be a little reductive, but it is true that she approached her social obligations with trepidation. She found a lot of value and validation in isolation. And for her, abstract art was a commitment and a problem that needed solving. And that was something that she could do best on her own in solitude. Um, so at the same time, there are also a lot of gallerists in the later half of the 50s, especially, that insisted that women artists were not marketable. So that could have contributed to this as well. And she also explores multiple styles throughout her career, as we've seen throughout the course of this presentation. And that makes it more difficult to easily fit her into a tidy narrative of abstract expressionism or abstraction in general. Throughout her career, she's really remaining faithful to her own tenets of the abstract expressionist movement and exploring and reworking several abstract styles and ideas, but always emphasizing her own ability to produce a certain harmony on the canvas. So that's kind of the through line and what she sticks with. And her story as well is perhaps more typical of a working artist. She devoted her life to art and supporting herself for 30 years, before taking a college teaching job on Long Island. So she doesn't have one of those tragic, tortured artist narratives that can sometimes have more traction in public imagination. But her story is perhaps more akin to what a lot of artists experience in their artwork and throughout their career. She has recently received long overdue attention in exhibitions that provide new insight into abstract expressionism, and that also includes a traveling retrospective, which was organized by Hofstra University, where she taught in 2009. So let's come back to our pale gold oval painting from the collection. This is a piece coming from 1979. So in this kind of last decade of her life before she passes away in 1988. And we can see how it relates to some of these later works and how it relates to some of the earlier pieces too. But this isn't an idea that exists only in this piece. She did do something similar earlier on. So in 1960, with this untitled piece, Mixed Media on Paper, we can see that she's already playing with that idea of that oval and this kind of grid-like construction to her composition. But here she's using a lot more color, playing with a lot more tones going on here. And so in the later piece that we're looking at with pale gold oval painting, she's really kind of simplified things down, fitting with that style that she takes on in the later part of her life. With this piece, we see that characteristic rhythm that appears in this painting that we've seen kind of throughout her career. She's using this repetitive, alternating vertical black dots and solid yellow lines. And I have a couple of details to show here. So you can see there's sort of these faint vertical lines, and on those lines we've got the little dots. Um, those are alternating with the painted yellow lines, creating that rhythm and that repetition. There are a couple of faint horizontal lines as well, indicating that idea of a grid-like structure, a grid-like system. We also see, looking at these details, the edges, which I don't think you get as much of a sense of from the overall image. But the way it's not kind of a perfect line, she's created this sketchiness at the edge, kind of bringing in some graphite, some pencil there, and creating that sketchiness at the edge. The color as well. This is one of those pieces that I think it rewards seeing it in person and spending some time with it and getting a close look. You know from the title that it's called Pale Gold Oval Painting, but that doesn't quite read as much in photographs. And so I'm hoping you're getting a little sense of it from the details here. But what she's created here in the paint that she's using here does have that metallic sheen to it. So there is a little bit of a glint, a little glimmer there. It creates interest in the work. It creates some added depth to the piece and really does kind of draw you in as you're looking at the work. Another kind of earlier piece where she's doing something similar is this piece, Green Gold. Where again, it's this floating gold oval, but this time containing a grid of green and orange lines. So again, moving from this earlier piece to the piece that we have in our collection, she has simplified things down and created something that is perhaps a little more muted, a little more quiet in its construction. But it still has this sort of quietness that it emanates and also a certain light that it seems to emanate as well, despite being kind of a very simplified piece. She has a quote from this kind of later period of her career. I believe she's referring specifically to the Accordment series, but I think it also applies to works like this too, from this period in her career. So she said, quote, "My painting in the last couple of years is of a subjective nature. It is my answer to the violence, noise, and strife rampant in our world today. It is non-gestural. It is a whisper in reply to a shout." End quote. And so I think that applies really nicely to this piece and kind of gives us a little idea of her inner processes and what she was thinking of when she was creating these later works. So I will stop there, but thank you so much for going through this kind of whirlwind exploration of Pearl Fine's career. Are there any questions for me before we wrap up?
Julie, I have a question for you.
Yes.
In your research on a wonderful, wonderful presentation, in your research, was there any relationship between Pearl Fine and Agnes Martin?
Oh, I don't know that I came across anything with the two of them. Because I know I read about her and Lee Krasner and the strong relationship there. Um, but I don't know that I encountered anything about Agnes Martin. Yeah, that would be interesting to look
I,
into.
yeah, I just sort of some of her work made me think of, especially the grids and the dots, made me think of Agnes Martin, but I do not know of any relationship between the two. if there is, you probably would have stumbled across it, I imagine.
Yeah, maybe, but that is interesting. It does make me want to take a look and see. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Oh, and Angie was wondering the same thing about Martin. So good thought. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I so appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your evening. And please come out to the museum sometime and check out this work and this exhibition. Thank you so much. Good night.